Welcome back to the Impact Driven Leader podcast. This is your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. So thankful that you chose to spend a bit of your day with me today and my guest, David Burkus. David is an international speaker, author. He wrote the book that we're featuring here in the Impact Driven Leader Book Club. Best team ever. Have it right here. So excited to speak with David about this book. David introduced himself to me after hearing my podcast with mutual friend Ryan Estes and shared his latest book. And I'm thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It was amazing. It was a great read. It was a very timely read for me. And this is one thing that I've learned is no matter where you're at in life, it's been my student journey in leadership. No matter what industry you're in, I came from agriculture. Today, we're talking about a lot of different industries. Maybe you're coming and listening from production to manufacturing to people to real estate to network marketing to all the different industries out there in the world. Or you're a coach. And this is the thing I know, is that it all centers around people. As my friend Chris Allen shares, it's always about people. Well, David shares 3 topics in the book and then examines them with 2 elements each. These are simple, they're logical, yet it's the simple that people fail most often to execute. He shares stories in the science behind them with examples of people that grew just like I did. And I'm encouraging you to listen in and be willing to grow and say, how can I apply that in my world and my leadership? One reminder, if you're not a subscriber to the Impact Driven Leader podcast, do yourself a favor, tap subscribe so new episodes hit your library every Friday. And if you're watching from YouTube, glad to see you. You will also get alerted to my daily chats if you subscribe there, where I share what I'm learning, a little bit about each podcast before it releases, so you can be prepared for the podcast each Friday. So here we go. Let's listen to this conversation with David Burkus. David, excited to be here with you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for reaching out. You reached out. You shared your book with me. I have been enamored by it. As I mentioned to you in the open, it is an extremely timely read, an enjoyable read, great stories. But let's kind of set that aside and let's start talking just about leadership. And I'd love for you to just kind of share, as you know, whether this book or the other 5 books that you've written, where does your take on leadership kind of come into as far as how you're trying to help other leaders?
Yeah. I guess my take would be just how much rises and falls on teamwork and collaboration and what have you. And yet so much of the content that's out there aimed at leaders is kind of focused on the one-on-one relationship, which is fine, right? Leaders need to know how to have crucial conversations and they need to know how to inspire each individual person and what have you. But like, if you're a leader at any level, your job is to be sort of chief culture officer for your team. Right? So you're the one that's helping to set the habits, the norms of behaviors, the way we interact with each other, how much trust we have, et cetera. That's all your job. And that doesn't necessarily come from thinking one-on-one, right? That comes from thinking about what the good of the team is, including sometimes having uncomfortable conversations. Like I was asked the other day, what do you do with a great performer who's not a great team player? And I was dumbfounded. I'm sitting there on stage and they asked me that. I'm like, well, is part of their job working on a team? Yeah. Then they're not a great performer. Right?
Yeah. Like I think of the classic example that Wooden wrote about. And I wish I remembered the player's name. I haven't searched it yet, but he had a player. He was the best player at UCLA, but yet he benched him because the team doesn't play the best with you.
Right.
And yet so many leaders are afraid to do that. And I think that is one of the issues that leads into teams struggling, because leaders are often remiss to bench the star player in position of someone who actually is a better team player where the team performs better.
Yeah. And some of this is the systems that kind of reiterate it, right? Like you go to work for an organization, you get paid one salary to one individual person. Yeah. Okay, no problem with that. But then even our incentive compensation systems and our performance rating systems and what have you are all based on that individual. And so much of, if you work for a large organization, how you do your feedback sessions and what have you has been structured. And it's been structured on the individual. I lead a team of 10 people, so I've got 10 relationships I've got to get ready for, and 10 documents I have to fill out, and 10 conversations I have to have. And yet, what actually matters is how well each of the one individual people relate to the other 9. That's like sort of the fundamental. And so we don't do that. I mean, I way back in 2016, I had a book out called Under New Management that was all about workplace trends and what have you. And one of the things we explored in that was performance is a team sport. Like, talent is important, but we too often draw this direct correlation between talent and performance. And that's not true. Talent is it's like gasoline, right? Gasoline is latent energy. You can leave it sitting there and nothing happens, or you can put it in an engine and then it turns into forward motion or whatever power you're looking to generate. Teams and talent are the same way, right? The talent doesn't make the team makes the talent. It's the engine that unlocks that performance. And so if you're not paying attention to that, right, if you're just too busy doing all of these individual performance reviews, what have you, and you're ignoring that, not only are you potentially doing the toxic thing by letting a star player still destroy your team, you're actually disserving people who need to be more collaborative in order to have that thing unlocked.
Yeah. So reading through your book, Best Team Ever, and one of the things that struck me, and I'm going to sow the seed now and then we'll come back to it later, is none of it to me, granted it's what we're in, is revolutionary. But yet I know, and as I shared with you, leaders struggle with it. Coaches struggle with it day in, day out, in all circumstances, in all teams. And to me, what's great about that, it doesn't matter if you're wherever there are people, it all applies. And I think some leaders mistake that. Oh, I work in the auto industry. I work in, some other furniture sales. I work in all these different, it can't be the same. And as I've learned through my background, if there's people, it's all the same.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit like, I make this joke often. I was an undergrad English major, and so I had to read a lot of different novelists, including Tolstoy. And there's this novel, Anna Karenina, and it opens with the line, all happy families are alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way. Teams are kind of the same thing, right? There's a lot of different reasons a team might be dysfunctional, but you look across the spectrum, not only in business, but in sports, in any industry, all high-performing teams are actually alike. It's every dysfunctional team that's dysfunctional in its own unique way. It's very, very similar. And I agree with you. Common sense in a sense. It's not really all that common practice. And so the goal, this is actually a little bit different book than what I've ever written, because the goal was to bridge that gap for people. Normally I just go, here's the idea and here's the research that supports the idea and a fun case study and what have you. This one, every single chapter ends with here's 4 or 5 things you can do, because it's that knowing doing gap. Right? There's 3 main principles in the book. Your average leader probably implements 2 out of the 3 of them already. It's going to be different, right? But 2 out of the 3 of them already. The goal is to help you not only see that third one, but then get better at practicing all 3.
So I want to walk through that, because I think it's powerful to walk through them. I would even go this step further, because you have 3 points and each of those has 2. So there's 6 total, I would say,
I'll be honest, I'm
and
cheating
actions.
there a little bit.
And I think what happens is those are the ones that get missed. To me, and go back, and I shared this with you as we were opening up. You're from the Northeast. I'm from Ohio. Went to school in Northeast. I struggled with being super intense and not having enough empathy. And you talk about, you open the book with that, which elates me, because to me, that is the great solution. And yet I find that people don't realize it's the solution because they don't know what problem empathy will solve.
Yeah.
And I think go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you picked up on something that not a lot of people who've read the book so far picked up on, right? So the subtitle is The Surprising Science of High-Performing Teams. The surprise is that each of those 2 are paired, right? So pretty much every leader knows you need to have good clarity, role clarity, execution, what have you, but it's packed with empathy, which is what you're getting at. Same thing in the second one, and we can talk about it when it comes to that, and same thing in the third one. The surprise is always, it's not actually this, it's this plus this other element. And in the case of getting the team on the same page, that empathy piece is exactly that hidden element.
Well, and I think, as you start, and it's kind of, you could almost do a pyramid-esque go back to Wooden, is, pyramid of success. It's a pyramid of common understanding. I'm going to go through it for you here. Common understanding to, psychological safety. And then it's ending it. And, the end part of it, when you get to the pro-social purpose, which I got to have you define a little bit clearer, is the top of the pyramid. And it's like when you work that way, you can actually get to that point of impact. It's, to me, as a leader, being impact-driven leader is the title of this. That's what I aim for, because it's not about me going searching for me first. It's realizing if I do all the things to build, clarity and empathy and trust, and I, build that upon each other, the impact will come. But you can't flip the pyramid over. It'll just crush you.
Yeah, well, no one will believe you. Right? When you start talking purpose, but you haven't built psychological safety, or nobody knows what they're supposed to be working on, but you talk about the impact you're going to make, it all kind of falls apart, right? So that's a good, I drew the triangle differently, but pyramid's a good way to think about it. I like that.
I like how you draw. Again, I'm aligned with that. I think it's perfect, but yet the idea, so often leaders like, okay, here's what our goal is. It's like, no one cares about where you're going to go until they know you care about them and whatever that journey means. I was sharing with you why this is so timely is I'm involved in a youth sports team and I see it going all wrong. And I believe I'm more sensitive to it because, one, the work that I do, doing this, reading this book, having this conversation, but having gone through it myself, being that leader that was oblivious to others, where if I read through my 360 review of 5 and 6 years ago, and it was like, it's all about him. And I'm like, no. That's not in my heart, but yet that's how I showed up to people.
Yeah.
So let's walk through.
No,
go ahead.
No. You let's walk through a perfect transition.
Yeah. So let's walk
we'll
through
cut all that out later.
The 3 elements. Yeah. Let's walk through the 3 elements: the common understanding, psychological safety, and pro-social purpose. Let's break that apart and kind of chew on it a bit.
Yeah. So common understanding, first kind of element. Let's I like this metaphor, the foundation of the pyramid, right? I usually sometimes call it blocking and tackling, like the basics of teamwork, right? And it's how well people have a shared understanding of the people on the team's tasks, their knowledge, skills, and abilities, but also the context they're working in, their personality differences, their work preferences. And actually, you could argue differences in preference matter more than differences in personality, but we could go on a whole tangent there. And here where the surprise is, a lot of people think this is just about clarity. How well do I go over goals and break down our large thing into milestone goals? How well do we run our weekly check-in meetings and what have you? And that's important. You can't ignore that. The difference is that clarity is needed not only around task, but also clarity of person. That's really what separates the difference between decently performing teams and high-performing ones. High-performing, if you want to get nerdy about the research literature on this, it's actually not called empathy, it's called collective intelligence. And the trigger for collective intelligence is social sensitivity. Empathy seemed to be a more clear word, so I went for it, right? How well, and it's not empathy in the sense of like, I feel your pain, but it's how well do I understand where you're coming from? How well do I understand your past experiences, your perspectives? How well, for a lot of us that are, in our normal work life, although teams come from all spheres of our life, but in our normal work life, so many of us are working in different contexts right now. We've got some people that are pushing to go back to the office. Some people want to be hybrid. Some people are trying to stay remote forever. But each environment is different, and you expect different things from different people when they're in that environment. So how well do we understand kind of all of that? Now, as a leader, this is huge, not only because you want your team to have that sense of empathy with each other so they better understand each other, but you need it. The example that you were sharing with me, if you don't have that empathy side, clarity, if you're coaching or something like that in a sports team, is about giving people feedback on their performance. You did this, but I need you to do this. When you're shooting for this, I need that. Like, you need to give very clear feedback. Yeah. But you have to have empathy for the person in order to understand how to give them that feedback. I really get frustrated when people share these trite things like the compliment sandwich, right? Of like, oh, this is the perfect way to give feedback to everybody. Compliment them and then put your criticism in and then another. And by the way, that's the only sandwich in human history that's ever been named by the bread on the outside, compliment sandwich. It's not a compliment sandwich. It's a crap sandwich. That's what's in the middle of it, right?
Yeah.
But some people are fine taking that constructive criticism.
Yeah.
And you need to know who it is, who you can just be blunt with and give that immediate feedback to, who you need to, I don't know, let's say soften the blow with, and who actually doesn't need your criticism at all, but needs more of like an appreciative inquiry approach where you're just complimenting their way into seeing the proper way to behave. That only comes from that understanding piece. That's not clarity of roles, that's clarity of person. And so you need it as a leader to make an impact, but then your team needs it with each other so they can collaborate better as well.
I think that is the case in point. And I would even say that the difference in feedback, the difference in conversation of those individuals has more to do with their psychological safety and trust of that leader than it does anything else. I can be direct with someone that knows exactly what their role is. They understand their value to the team. You can be more direct there because they're not sitting there saying, am I of any value here? You tear me apart. You tell me that I did something wrong. I might as well just be off the team because that might be easier for you. Because the person that you are direct with that knows that they are solid, they are a valuable piece, they see it in all ways, they're not sitting there saying, do I even have a reason to be here?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So I mean, textbook definition of psych safety is this idea that the group is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, which is really about admitting failures, suggesting ideas that might seem a little crazy or what have you. But there's a sub-element to it. Amy Edmondson, the brilliant researcher who kind of uses this phrase for teams, she calls it a climate of mutual trust and respect, right? And I think this is the hidden secret or like the surprising science of this element, is people think it's just trust. But in reality, it's trust plus respect. When you're giving that person that feedback, do they still feel respected as a person? If they do, they grow in their trust for you, right? When they're being vulnerable and coming to you with a problem, right? Are you listening to that? And are you respecting them still as a valuable person who has a contribution to make that is just facing that sort of setback, right? So all of that has to do with that sense of, it's not that we never tell anyone like negative feedback. It's not that, safe spaces or whatever you would call it. You're not going to hear, it's not like you're never going to hear things you disagree with. You're going to hear things you disagree with. But when you do, you're respected, and you're listened to as a person, right? I from a leadership perspective, I see this, and we talked about it in the coaching and giving feedback example, but the worst one I see is when people, especially new leaders, get it in their head that they were promoted because they had all the answers, and so now they have all the answers. And so when people come to them, right, it's their job to just pass back that advice immediately. No, it's your job to listen. And it's your job to guide people to a realization that's probably already inside of them, and all along the way, make them feel kind of respected. The other thing you might do is go the opposite way and get so focused on not just giving everyone the answers that you say stuff like, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. I mean, you've heard that, right? I hate that phrase. I hate it, right?
Well,
and it's well-meaning, right? You don't want...
You're having that conversation. Hey, here's the problem. Great, let's go through let's solutions. Or is that really the problem? Where it's a listening and it's a conversation and it's not pointing fingers.
Yeah.
But I can come to you and say, David, okay, this is the problem I'm having. I'm not getting it. Let's walk through this together. And that takes me back to a previous term, empathy. And what I find is I believe empathy is one of the two most misdefined or misunderstood words in this sphere. To me, empathy, people are just like, what is it? Is it being soft? Is it being sympathetic, as you talk about in the book? My definition of empathy, and I want to see how you react to this, is putting your arm around someone and walking with them.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I tend to think the goal is to be able to see things from their perspective, to understand them so well that when they come to you with a problem, you can kind of put on glasses that are, I put on Tyler's glasses and I see this problem from Tyler's perspective and I understand it, right? Now, you can't do that if you're not walking alongside them, right?
Yeah.
If facing you, I can't do it. If I want to have your perspective, it's kind of like if you've ever tried to we were stargazing. We were out in the desert like a month ago and trying to look at certain stars. And if you ever tried to do that with someone else, what do you have to do? You point up to it, but then they have to get their face like right next to yours in order to see things from your perspective. So I think our kind of definitions merge really nicely there. I'm not going to be able to see things from your perspective if you're not walking alongside of me, and vice versa.
Here's the other layer there that you just pointed out. When you do that, there's a tremendous amount of vulnerability. If I raise my hands in the air, I'm vulnerable. And as I've learned from, people in special forces, when they succeed as a team is when they raise their arms and link it together. There's a vulnerability there. As you talked about putting your face side by side, as a leader, I may not see it, but I'm going to put my face beside yours in letting you guide me see what you see. And then I can say, oh, I see it differently. Let me describe it, or vice versa, back forth. And then we can proceed forward, which that lends to the trust and the respect. Because if your ability to practice empathy, well, then in order to enhance that, there has to be trust and respect. And it has to develop that psychological safety. Again, that's where, in my mind, I see it as a pyramid. It's kind of like if you have that understanding, then you go to the next level of that trust and that respect. And then finally, we get to the third piece.
Yeah. I mean, trust and respect is a cycle, right? Someone steps out in vulnerability and trusts the group or trusts you as a leader. And when you respond with respect, when you respond with empathy, they feel like their trust was worth it. So now they trust you more. If you're working with a team, by the way, and that cycle's not happening because nobody trusts each other, guess what? You go first, right? You be vulnerable first. And I'm not talking about deal-breaking levels of vulnerability. You don't have to tell your whole team, I feel like my parents never loved me, or I never had a date for the junior prom. But saying, I don't know, like you said, throwing your hands up in the air, just being like, I don't know, what do you think? Right? Or, man, I'm really stumped on this. Right? Or even just little micro vulnerabilities like, hey, the reason I always want to talk things out in person is I have terrible grammar, right? Or what have little moments like that. When you admit them, when you're vulnerable, people immediately, you could see this, by the way, neurochemically in the brain. Paul Zach's a brilliant researcher that's done a ton on this. I feel like every researcher I've cited on this show so far, I preface with brilliant. I mean, I suppose if they weren't brilliant, I wouldn't be talking about them.
Probably
right?
not.
But you can see it when someone trusts. You can see a spike in oxytocin in their bloodstream and in their brain.
Loved
they
that piece that you
and oxytocin is a love molecule.
Yeah. It almost as a leader, if you think about how do I most quickly develop trust with other people, find ways to enhance oxytocin. To me, that's a no-brainer. That's going to bridge that gap, and it's going to take down that barrier of protectionism. Say, oh, okay, how do I get there? And again, understanding the biology of why oxytocin does what it does makes total sense. And it comes back to this is like, oh, it's not that hard. Comes back to it earlier when it's like all of this to me is common sense. Granted, work in this, but it's not that hard. And I think about what is the barrier from people being willing to do that. And you mentioned that earlier in that junior leader, that new leader that's thinking, I need to know all the answers. And so their insecurity to me is the barrier from them doing what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, because you were promoted for having all the answers, right? So admitting you don't is like threatening the reason you were promoted. But like two things, right? Number one, as soon as you've been in the role for a while, the world is changing so fast and technical expertise struggles to keep up that if you've been a leader for longer than a year, you actually don't have all the answers. Your team probably knows the subject more because you've been focused on the management aspect of it. Yeah. But number two, they already know you don't have all the answers. Like it's impossible for you to have all of the answers and they already know that. So pretending to have all the answers, that doesn't serve anyone.
Yeah. Well, what it does is it creates people reliant on you for every answer. And that's not going to lead to a team maximizing performance because they can't be in every situation with the leader robotically dictating everything they do. That's not efficient. You talk about it. I've read about it in other ways. It's like, hey, the best way to get out of that is if you're a leader and you think it's all on me, then put it all on you. And you're going to quickly find out I can't do it all. So then rely on your team because they're there to help you.
Yeah. The irony here is this is what also leads to sort of the number one cause of burnout in leaders too, right? And it's kind of funny because it's sort of you're doing it to yourself. You trained people to come to you with all the answers, and now why do you feel like you're constantly fighting fires? Because you told your team you're a firefighter, right? Instead of I will get you the resources you need to implement the solution you've come up with, right? Or I'll help you think through the solutions, but ultimately, right, this decision or this action rests on you instead of me doing it for you. Yeah, yeah.
So let's talk about pro-social purpose. Let's talk about meaning and impact. Impact gets me excited, obviously, the title of this show. But I want to hear from you.
It was sort of the
again.
reason I reached out to you to begin
good.
with.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense. Define pro-social purpose. Because I think it's worth asking for a quality definition.
Yeah, so pro-social purpose is felt when people feel like they're making a meaningful contribution toward work that benefits others, right? So if you think about, remember, everything is sort of twos: meaningful contribution and work that benefits others. That first one I call meaning. If you want to get nerdy, that's called task significance in organizational psych, in the stuff I had to do my doctorate in, right? People want to know that the work they're being asked to do contributes to the larger work the organization is doing. That's how they judge whether or not it's sort of meaningful, right? And that's different than what we might personally use vernacularly as meaning. Well, a lot of times what we use when we think meaning is actually impact. In other words, who is impacted by the work that we do. I'm a big fan of giving teams a reason for why we do what we do, but most teams, that reason that's going to be most motivating is actually not answering why, it's answering who. As in who is served by the work that we do. So there's two things we got to do as a leader here. Number one, we have to show them that the work that they're doing makes a contribution, that they're making a meaningful contribution in order to up that meaning. And then the second thing we need to do is we need to point to who is served by the work that we do. And this one's actually a little tricky because not every team can point to the customer or the stakeholder or whomever. There's a lot of teams, especially if you're in a large organization, their who is actually someone else in the organization. We exist to empower this team, and then this team does that, and it's kind of a chain. And so your who may not be, I mean, yeah, you could run a thought experiment and always end at the customer eventually, but that's not everyone. Some people's customer is internal, some person's who is internal. And then once we know who that is, we really need to work to tell those stories of impact, not just that end user impact.
Well, I think what even happens in say it's a small organization, a small team, the impact can be within the team, to other members of the team, to other team members. If I do what only I can do, and that allows you to accomplish more than you could, it's where I got excited reading about culture. And you talked about culture in the sense that when they studied and looked at it, culture trumped talent. Because when the culture allowed for everyone to work together, it exceeded the individual level of talent. And to me, that is really what is impactful. I mean, that's why I do what I do, is to help others accomplish more than they thought they could. And it is that in and of itself.
Yeah, and that in and of itself can be a powerful individual motivator, right? And so this term pro-social purpose originated from a stream of research from like Adam Grant and a few others on what they called pro-social motivation. When you show people how their work is helping someone else, whether it was one experiment that's really, really cool and well designed was around call center workers at a donation call center, like calling for donations and seeing who received scholarships from that, and that had them work harder and work smarter. Another was around, this one actually freaked me out, was around doctors and nurses hand washing. Like they're more likely to actually wash their hands between procedures if there are signs in the restrooms and hand washing stations that talk about patient safety than they are their own individual safety. Now, first of all, this freaks me out because I just assume doctors are washing their hands after every single one, but you can't run a study like this unless... She really does. There's me, because her and me, and then we have two boys. So trust me, like we get told to wash our hands all the time, right? But I just assumed everybody was doing that. But it turns out that pointing to who is served by doing that action increases motivation to do that action on an individual level. Then they went a step further, and it turns out that those reminders of who's served and this pro-social motivation actually, I'm getting really nerdy here. I apologize to everybody.
You're good.
But
I mean, I'm
actually
okay.
leads to an increase in what we call organizational citizenship behaviors. Org psychologists, by the way, we ruin common sense things because we come up with 3-word definitions. Because you could call organizational citizenship behavior teamwork. It's literally how often and what behaviors do I do that put we over me. That's what organizational citizenship behavior is. And when people have that sense of pro-social motivation, they're more likely to do those things. So not only are you motivating people individually, you're also motivating them to put their own interests aside in the service of that who. That's impact, right? And that's the reason we use that term for that kind of phenomenon.
One piece that I think really enters in here is celebrating the small wins, because in so many teams and organizations, we can't see it. There was a line that I completely forget from the book, but I'm so glad you included in your book. It was from Adam Grant's work where they said at the call center, doing a good job here is like wetting your pants in a dark suit. You get a warm feeling, suit, but no one else notices. And having worked in an industry that was like that, I relate to that so much. And yet, when you're looking at what is a win today, maybe it's not closing a sale, maybe it's not saving a life, maybe it's not whatever, it's just doing your job the best you could is the win. That it takes other people recognizing like, man, thank you for doing that, because that allowed me to actually do what I can do well. It's having that community of understanding the meaning, which goes all the way back to clarity and the empathy and the trust and the respect, to finally come about it and say, hey, you know what? I couldn't do what only I can do if you didn't do what only you could do. And that's what allowed it actually to happen.
Yeah. So you're hitting on 2 things here that I think are really cool and want to explore, right? So the first thing is that sense of interdependence. I couldn't do what I do without you, right? That's what I love about regular kind of celebrations of wins. And you could do this any way you want. There's a variety of different ways to do it. Some teams will try and have one person share a win by the end of the day every day. Others will have everyone on the team share one out. One team I worked with, we made it a competition, like how fast can we rack up 3 wins today? And like, hey, it's 10:30 and we hit it. Let's try and do it by 10:28 next. Like, you could do it in a variety of different ways. What matters is not only are people getting applause and getting kudos for those small wins, when you as a leader are facilitating this, you're pointing out that win, Tyler couldn't do that win if it weren't for so-and-so. So you're reinforcing that sense of interdependence, right? So that's thing one. The second is the sense of gratitude that comes from that. You mentioned that thank you. And I think this is big because this is where, we talk about common sense, but not common practice, right? Lots of leaders know, I need to express gratitude. And so they just say, hey, Tyler, thanks so much for that. That works, but that doesn't spread pro-social motivation. A great thank you from a leader or from a teammate to another one has 2 parts. Thank you so much for doing this because it allowed me to do that. Right? Thank you so much for getting that data to me in timely fashion, faster than you said you were going to, because it allowed me to prep the slide deck for the client and crush the presentation, right? So the first part is thank you, is that expression of gratitude. But the second is how you helped me. So it's a reminder that your work helps me. In other words, it's a pro-social motivation reminder, a pro-social purpose reminder in every single sense of gratitude. And by the way, that's not only, if you're a leader, that's not only your team, teaching your team to do that to the other leaders in the organization so that they have a thank you to take back to their team as well, that helps their team get a sense of how interdependent the different teams in the organization are too.
Yeah, we're a social being, right? Every one of us has a social right? We can't absolutely totally separate by ourselves and survive. And yet now to come back and hopefully harvest that seed, so often where I think teams go wrong is when either individual performers, team members, or leaders feel like it's either all on me or I don't need the rest of the team. I am so good, I can do it alone. And yet that isn't the reality, but yet not going through the clarity and the empathy and the trust and the respect and the meaning and the purpose, not hitting all of those starts to identify people, you don't need me. Because I think in summary of this, if you're hitting all 6, then you're expressing to people how much you value them, how much you respect them, and how needed they are. And if you don't hit on those, then the whole pyramid starts to crumble because you're saying, in essence, I don't need you.
Yeah. Yeah. Towards the end of the book and in speeches I give, I often summarize the entire thing, right? The 3-part model that boils down into 2. So the total's for 6, right? How about 2 sentences? People want to do work that matters and work for leaders who tell them they matter. Right. And so fundamentally, those are the 2 biggest pieces of your job, right? Show people how the work that we're doing matters, makes an impact, but also let people know that you matter and that I'm here to support you and what have you. And if you could do those 2 things, and hopefully we give you, there's like 30 something different activities you can do in the book to do that, but that's like the goal. Right. And when I think of impact driven leader, that's the same thing I think about too. How well are they showing? Here's the impact that we're making, but also I care about making an impact in your life because you matter too.
Yeah. So why do so many leaders get it wrong? Why do so many leaders, it's giving you a job, it's giving me a job, it's giving anyone that's willing to care about this an opportunity. And in our world today, more people are looking for our guidance. Metric wise, that's not about me. That's just about what we see in the world. Why?
Yeah, well, so we already hit on the technical problem, right? This idea that you were promoted into leadership because of, you were a great individual contributor, and so you just think you need to keep being an expert, et cetera. But, I also think, and I'm not, although if you're listening to this and you want to make this a political statement, you can make a political statement. But I also think we've got really bad role models right now, right? I mean, we've got corporate leaders, feels like they're constantly being indicted. We got presidents that whoever it is on either side, the other half of the country hates, right? And they feel like they're only, so we don't have those kind of bridge builders. I talk about in the book, Alan Mulally, who was the CEO that turned around Ford Motor Company from 2000. Yeah. In my opinion, like we need to tell stories like his more often. Or I love John Wooden, but my favorite UCLA coach is actually Valerie Kondos Field, right?
Who's also I learned about her. I want to talk to her. She sounds amazing.
Amazing, right? Right. I feel like we just need those stories more because whether you you can look at an example of, insert your narcissistic startup $1 billion unicorn company person here, right? And you can look at them and say, yeah, they're examples of what not to do. But we do kind of mimic what we see more and more often. Yeah. And so I think and this is part of the reason I still keep all of those case studies in the book, is we need to be telling the stories and helping people pick the role models that are like that, right? Instead of these other ones that draw all the attention, get all the clicks and what have you. Those kind of humble leaders. Alan's a great. I was with him this weekend actually. We were at the same conference, and so we were hanging out for a little bit. And he's somebody that the dude's not exactly tech savvy. He doesn't care what his Instagram is. He's not on Twitter. He's not paying attention to any of that. He's this soft-spoken kind of Kansas farm boy with a brilliant mind and a sense for empathy that knows how his impact is, and he's kind of fine with that. Yeah. And I think those are the stories we need to hear more often so that people emulate them. Yes. I think that's probably, in addition to the problem of technical expertise, I think that's the other thing. We just have terrible role models. Christine Porath, we talk about her in the Respect chapter, world's most respected researcher on respect and civility in the workplace. And the number one thing that she sees as a reason for incivility in the workplace is a lack of positive role models at the top. And that's not to say they're not there. They just don't get all the attention in the media spotlight. And so we need to make a deliberate effort to spotlight them more.
I think that is a very astute, and I think we see that in workplaces, but where I also am recognizing it. And my wife and I had this discussion this morning, is as parents, and I know you have, a couple boys and probably many people listening. Are we willing to really stop and think about the people who are modeling our children in their sports, in their activities, and saying, as we go through this and and I share with you where I'm at, and that's what I'm wrestling with right now. And that's part of it. And it's like, you know what? Is this an example of what not to be? Or is this an example of what to expect in a team and how teams work? And I think that is sometimes it's by pure ignorance that we don't know ourselves what a good team looks like until we're on one and we're like, wow, that was amazing. How does that happen? And part of, I think, whether the genius, whether the simplicity of it is, it's not this amazing, art that just happens to be. You mentioned different research articles in here. It's when you actually care about people that all the great performance occurs.
Yeah.
And it's to me, it's that simple. And so what's that barrier? To me, it's insecurity. It was my intensity. It was those things that we've discussed continually be the barrier where leaders struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, we could do a whole other 60 minutes on the problems of youth sports teaching leadership and teamwork right now, right? But in this hyper competitive world where everyone's trying to qualify for the next level of competitive team and what have you, it's a very individualistic mindset. It's not just, yeah, there's a problem with parents screaming at umpires and all that sort of stuff, but it's not just them. There's a whole system that prizes that individual over that team commitment, et cetera. And it's no surprise that you carry that with you when you get into those leadership roles, right? Is that lack of modeling kind of happens. And so, yeah, that's been
That's where we
my kind of goal at the 3 or the 6. Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, I remember, you remember Randy Pausch, the famous last lecture in the book and what have you. He has this great line in there about like short course on leadership. Write down a list of everything that bad bosses did that drove you nuts. Don't do them, right? That second part is the hardest because when you get stressed, what do? You mimic who you witnessed in those similar situations. And it takes a lot of deliberate effort to train yourself to respond better.
Well, and it takes a lot of humility in those instances to say, oh, I did this wrong. And that vulnerability coming back to the empathy that I described actually does more, in my opinion, in my experience, to build trust than thinking I'm going to get it right every time. The fact that, you know what? No, I screwed that up. I shouldn't have done that. As a parent, I have to do that daily. And yet what I find is my kids, my children are more accepting of that, and they're more willing to roll with it rather than these barriers that start to come between us. And what I realize is they are people, and individuals that I lead and I work with are people too. And there's not a difference.
It's weird. It's a difficult, I have to have it all the time as a parent and sometimes as a leader too. It's difficult to have that conversation where you responded wrong in a situation. But they're still in the wrong. And to go to them and go, I'm sorry, I behaved poorly here when this happened. That doesn't absolve you, right? I'm thinking mostly about kids here. Like that doesn't mean what you did isn't wrong, but my response to that was also wrong. And here's what we're both going to do, right? That's a hard conversation to have. It's even harder conversation to have when it's not like your child, when it's an employee of yours or what have you, that like, I said this and that was wrong. That was the wrong behavior. And here's what I'm going to move forward on. It's a difficult thing to say, and that's why it's not common practice. But the amount of, like you said, it's that cycle, the amount of trust that gets built when you're willing to say that, right? And then the next step, which is, and can you help keep me accountable to behaving that way in the future? The trust and respect that you gain from that is massive. It's uncomfortable. I get it. But there's a lot more comfort when you start winning because you built that level of safety on your team. Yeah.
Well, and I think, and through experience and just feeling myself, is when you're safe to have those conversations, that's when your performance is going to show it. Meaning if you're willing to have that conversation with that, superior, that coworker, that employee, it's like, hey, let's have this conversation. I handled it wrong, but this is what we're going to collectively do for it. And that actually gets done. Trust to me goes through the roof. It's where they say that, most organizations, you don't know how good their customer service is until something goes wrong. And that's when customer service actually is shown, oh, that was amazing. And companies build allegiance, customers build allegiance through those experiences. So,
and it's the same thing with team culture, right? You don't really know what a team culture is until they either A, face a setback or a failure, and failures are inevitable, by the way, or B, have to deal with the problem of a low performer. Right? Because and tolerating them and showing such empathy that you never address the problem, by the way, is not the answer, but neither is kicking them out right away either, right? So those are the two, those are the customer service moments, if you will. Those are the crucial moments that I watch on teams. How do you handle this? Like my number one question, this is sort of related to it. My number one question for leaders around psychological safety and also around team culture, when I'm trying to kind of diagnose the situation, is when was the last time someone on your team disagreed with you publicly? How'd it go? Right? If it was 6 months ago, we have a problem right there. But if it was last week or a month ago or what have you, okay, cool. How did it go? Tell me about how that, because those are those trial moments where you really get a sense of the culture that leader is building.
Yeah, well, it goes Case in point to, as you mentioned, Alan Mullally. And that's what he did at Ford. And
Yeah.
he embraced it. And it was a great example for all of us to look to. It's like, hey, if you disagree with me, awesome. Because that means you see something I don't see. And collectively, we can get better when we share those notes.
Yeah. And by the way, that's not to say he never had to deal with problems of underperformers, et cetera. We were talking about this weekend. When he came in, he was meeting with Bill Ford, great grandson of Henry Ford. And one of the conversations they had was, okay, who on the leadership team do we need to fire when you come in to make room for your people? He said, you don't need to fire any of them. And they were like, what? He goes, yeah, but I'm going to make them commit to a standard and to a set of norms and behaviors. One of them, my favorite one, was never a joke at someone else's expense, because it's not actually funny. And you're degrading that person's psychological safety. If I'm going to ask you to share the problems that are going on in your department and you think you're going to get made fun of, I'm not going to be able to hear the real problems. So never a joke at someone else's expense. And one of the things he told the board and he told Bill Ford was, not everybody on the team is going to be okay with how we're going to run. And they'll self-select out. I don't need to fire them ahead of time, and we don't need to guess who they're going to be. They will self-select out. And there really were situations. One was with one of the chief financial officers of the company that was kind of derogatory, always sort of cracking jokes at people's expense. And he tried to get that person to commit to it. And finally he said, you know, I want you to know, I understand where you're coming from, and it's okay. And the CFO was like, it's okay? You mean it's okay that I act like this? No. I want you to decide tonight whether or not you want to make the change or whether or not you want to go somewhere else. But I want you to know, whichever decision you make, it's okay. I still love you. I still support you. I can't let you act this way in front of the team. But whatever you decide, it's okay.
Yeah. Which is a powerful extension and visible display of trust, empathy, clarity, respect, meaning and purpose. All of them.
Yeah.
David, thank
By the
you
way,
so
there's
much.
a tangent on that. The reason we were talking about it this week.
Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. I was going to say, by the way, there's a tangent on that. The reason we were talking about it this weekend is that CFO came back to him a couple months ago and said, you remember that conversation? I really wish I would have taken you up on the offer to make a change. The rest of my career would have gone really, really well as well.
Yeah. And that to me as a leader, those are the kind of impacts to have. Because if you burn that bridge, you'll never have that. The people that have done that to me, the person I am today is because of those experiences and looking back, and the ones that were gracious enough to say, I still love and care about you, are the ones that have changed my life. And the ones that, were quick to dismiss or they'll never change or whatever else, those are the ones that they didn't make the impact they could have. And that's plain and simple.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much.
Yep. Oh, thank you so much for having me.
One of the great facets that I learned through this simple framework that David put together is it's foundational. You heard me share that I look at this triangle, but built by layers of foundational layers. I believe that so often we skip past the foundation, and in this, my understanding, it's common understanding, is through role clarity. It's clarity between the leader and everyone else. Say, hey, this is what I see in you. This is how I know the team can benefit from you. This is how I'm going to utilize your skill set. Let's be on the same page. That clarity and empathy between each other and understanding really defines to me where a team can go. And then it's with psychological safety. I believe it's so prominent in our world today. People are yearning for safety. We have generations that are looking for safety in a tumultuous world. And so they want relationships that give them safety, because quite often outside of our work relationships, maybe it's not real safe. Maybe it's scary. We see that all over. And so with trust of each other and respect, we add that second layer of psychological safety. And then third, pro-social purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? What meaning and impact does it have? I believe we yearn for that more and more and more as we go through life, because we realize that some of the tangible assets, they're either hard to come by, or they really don't give you that feeling, that fulfillment and service do. What meaning does what your team is doing have? What impact do you have? I believe those are the facets we all yearn for in life. Thanks for listening today. And another reminder, if you're not a subscriber, you can also subscribe to the Impact Driven Leader newsletter. Visit theimpactdrivenleader.com/free course. You can sign up to get my free video series, but as well, get my newsletter each week. It puts a nice little bow, a good summarization of the week, and prepares you for this podcast each Friday morning. I'd love for you to join in my community and learn more about the things I have to offer and share, but also get connected with other people of the community. Thanks for being here, and until next time, have a good one.